This is the Truth Be Told podcast, where we unlock the secrets of strategic communication. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Truth Be Told. Today, I'm joined by Anna Papalia, the CEO of Interviewology. Anna's a keynote speaker, a career influencer, a coach, an instructor, and an HR professional. She's worked with Fortune 100 companies, taught at Temple University School of Business, and has coached over 10,000 clients on how to interview better. Through her own self-awareness and curiosity, Anna collected data through hundreds of interviews, thousands of assessments, and created what's known as Interviewology, a scientific approach to identifying your own interview profile. In this episode, we're going to discuss those profiles to determine, are you a charmer, an examiner, a challenger, or a harmonizer? We'll discuss how to use this awareness as a hiring manager, a job seeker, or even going on a date. Make sure to stay tuned for the entire episode, as we're going to address some of the top interview questions asked and how to answer that dreaded strengths or weaknesses question. Let's get right to the conversation. Welcome to this episode of Truth Be Told. I am your host, Dave Thompson. I am here with my friend Anna. How are you today?
I'm great, Dave. How are you?
I am good. I'm excited today about our topic because it's interviewing, but not maybe the typical type of interviewing that our guests are used to, which is mostly investigative interviewing, although a job interview may seem a little intimidating of the same. So I know that guest heard a little bit about your background, but I've got your book in front of me, Interviewology, and we've talked about kind of your concepts of interviewing profiles and job interviewers and interviewees, but maybe you can expand a little bit on how you got interested in this field in the first place.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for having me. So previously I was a director of talent acquisition in the corporate world. I had done all of the, HR training and recruiting, and ultimately left my role as a director of talent acquisition because I thought that it was very strange that we don't have any tools backed in research and science to teach people how to interview. A job interview is one of the most important business decisions that we make, but 90% of hiring managers are never trained to interview. And I thought that that was very weird. So I left my corporate job in 2011 and started teaching at Temple University's Fox School of Business. And for the first about 5 years teaching in that department, I had this very cocky instinct, and I had this belief that, I knew what I was doing and do as I say.
Mm-hmm.
I had previously made all the decisions and hires, you need to interview like me in order to get a job. And about year 6, that started to sort of wear on me a little bit. And I started to wonder if all of my students were getting it. Right? I think most teachers come up with this at some point where you start to wonder is it the way you're teaching it, or is it your students? And if you're a good teacher, you ultimately are thinking, is it landing? Are they getting the lessons I'm teaching? And I was specifically teaching interview skills. And I had a light bulb moment. I asked myself a deep question that would really change my career for the rest of my life. I asked myself, well, what if we don't all interview the same way? What if we interview differently? What if there are different interview styles, much like love languages, but interviewing? And I set me down this course to collect lots of research and ask hundreds of my students. And I thought of this, and then all of a sudden, a year and a half later, I had collected over 300 samples of people's interview styles. I had interviewed over 200 of my students, and I wrote a personality assessment and discovered interview styles. And for me, it was really about helping people in a meaningful way, because what I realized is we don't all interview the same way. So if I could figure out how you interview, I can meet you where you are and give you really great advice on how you interview versus how I am doing it. Because we all give advice from who we are, right? So that was really my first intention and goal behind what I do. And then it kind of broadened into this much bigger thing over these last 10 years.
Yeah, I think it's incredible. And we'll talk about this. I had the opportunity to go through this shift profile, the Interviewology profile that you had created to identify kind of who I am. I'm thinking as you were talking, how many times during an interview, I wish I could have reached across the desk and told the person, hey, you suck at interviewing me. and you'd be like more conversational. Give them that feedback, or I'm sure they wanted to feel the same with
Hmm.
me. I want to just take this quote out of your book because it kind of goes along with what you just said. It says none of the existing interview advice works for one simple reason: it doesn't get to the heart of what actually makes a great interview or interviewer or interviewee: self-awareness. And you talk a lot. Maybe you can expand on this about be yourself. And for people that are listening, whether you're an interviewer or at some point you're interviewing for a job, that's what we're going to cover today. Is self-awareness. I think was the common theme you're hitting there.
For sure. And one thing I wanted to do that's sort of revolutionary in my book is I wanted to write to both job seekers and hiring managers, because the only interviewing advice out there that I can find really was only for job seekers. But an interview is an artificial event where this person has this like artificial power over you that they're going to hire you. But then very quickly, that recruiter or hiring manager could also be a job seeker and looking for a job. So those roles can change very quickly. And how you are as a job seeker or a hiring manager, your interview style doesn't change because it's based more on your personality, levels of introversion and extroversion, rather than, are you a hiring manager or a job seeker? For example, there are 4 interview styles. You interview as either a charmer, challenger, examiner, or harmonizer. And if you are a job seeker and you're a charmer, you're not all of a sudden going to become an examiner as a hiring manager. That's not the way it works, right? You are extroverted and you prioritize making a connection and getting people to like you. And that's how you're going to be as a hiring manager as well. And that's sort of revolutionary in what I'm doing in unpacking these interview styles. So it doesn't matter what side of the table you're on. And then in addition to that, the piece about self-awareness, I had taught thousands of students at the point that I started collecting this research and writing this book. And I asked myself, what makes some of my students really great at this? Or the people that I've seen that are like naturally good at interviewing. And what I came up with, it was one thing. They had really great self-knowledge, self-awareness. They knew themselves. Because an interview, I say this all the time on social, so if you follow me, you've heard me say it a million times. An interview is a set of questions about you. And the more you know yourself, the better you'll do. And as a hiring manager, an interview is all about you understanding your biases. So the better you know yourself, the better you'll do.
I think that's a simple but really powerful takeaway. I mean, the amount of times that people try to be somebody else during an interview, and you think about it, like you often wear clothes, you wear a suit, you wear a dress, you wear whatever that you don't maybe normally wear every single day. You walk in with a resume that you're not normally reading off every single. You're creating this whole fake persona, and when you do that, then you got to somehow fulfill that you later, right? If you get the job or you hire somebody, I can think of personal experience. I hate being scripted, right? You and I is just a natural conversation. We're just talking about whatever. And I was a guest on a podcast once where they literally gave me, here's the question I'm going to ask you, and here's like the topics we want you to cover. It was the most uncomfortable. I couldn't even listen to myself because that's not how I operate. So do you see that a lot? Do people try to be something they're not during an interview?
Well, I think it's all the old advice. So I read a lot of books on how to interview before I wrote my own. And it's really pervasive, this advice to just go in and tell them what they want to hear. Memorize the perfect answers. Where else in your life would you
Right.
get this advice and it'd be like, oh yeah, that's great advice. Like you're hoping to get this job and get hired and maybe work there for 2, 3, 4, 6 years. When does the mask come off? And I understand where it comes from. It's this place of like just really needing or wanting a job and wanting to impress them. But that we're moving away from that as a society and the way that we hire. It's more about leading with authenticity. I would much rather get rejected in the interview process and just find out immediately that I wasn't a good culture fit than work someplace for 6 months or a year and realize that I'm miserable and that we don't mesh. I would way rather figure that out in the interview process. And the way to do that is to be more of yourself. And what I found is people needed help to figure out what that was. So by creating this personality assessment and having people take our 20 question assessment on my website and then receive a 40-page customized workbook that tells them what impression that they make and what interviewing advice that they need and how extroverted or introverted they are in interviews and what impression that makes on other people, that helps so many, it's like holding a mirror up, right? It's like I'm basically like an interview therapist, like this is the impression that you're making when you do this or when you say this. That's the help I think people need, not these old books that's like memorize the perfect answers and you'll get the job.
Yeah, or come in with scripted questions to ask. I mean, that having objectives of what you want to learn about is important, but to me, you've talked a lot about how this interviewing, it's almost like you're going on a first date or you mentioned love languages before. It's like if you went on a date and you wrote a script of here's the questions I'm going to ask. And so if I asked you, do you like Italian food? And you said no, but my follow-up question was, well, what's your favorite Italian restaurant? Because that was the next time that ain't going to work. And so having flexibility is, and you talk a lot about that. I want to get back to the assessment though, that you created in the data. I went through this. I'm a harmonizer. So maybe you can kind of explain first of all, how did I get to that point? Like what categorizes me there? And then what does that mean in general terms? I know we could get into that for hours, but what do I
Sure.
take away from that?
Well, we could talk a long time about your personality, where it formed your childhood, how you
Right.
became a harmonizer.
Right.
But I'll tell you about the four interview styles. So we first have charmers. Charmers look at an interview like a performance, and they are the star of the show. Charmers want to make a connection. They really want to be liked in an interview. And then we have challengers. Challengers in interviews look at interviews like a cross examination. They're highly skeptical and they're going to figure something out. Challengers want to be respected in interviews. In the way charmers want to be liked, challengers want to be respected. And then we have examiners in interviews. Examiners look at an interview like a test that they are either going to pass or fail, and they want to get it right. In the way that charmers want to be liked, examiners want to get it right. And then lastly, we have harmonizers. And harmonizers look at an interview for like a tryout for a team that they'd like to join. They're collaborative, they're warm, they are easygoing, as the name kind of sounds like. They're harmonizers. Much different than their polar opposite, a challenger, where a challenger wants to figure something out and put a stake in the ground and be respected and heard. A harmonizer really wants to get along. They want to understand the group. They want to figure out the dynamic. They want to see if they fit in. They want to adapt. So in that way, you can see that we are set up for much different experiences. We have charmers who want to be liked, examiners who want to get it right, harmonizers who want to fit in, and challengers who want to be respected. And if we're all interviewing in these different ways, we are all getting our wires crossed and we're all set up for different expectations and experiences. And when I was in the corporate world, I had debrief with so many hiring managers and they would say things like at the end of the interview, well, I don't know. I just didn't like him. Like, what does that mean? I always want to be like, we need a language to talk about this. And so I hope after you discover your interview style and perhaps read my book about all four interview styles, what you come away with is maybe a debrief is a more productive conversation where you say something like, he kind of came in guns blazing. He asked me a bunch of really tough questions before we built rapport. And I'm a harmonizer in interviews. I really prefer to have some small talk or get to know someone before they do that. So he rubbed me the wrong way, but I can see how he'd be great at this job. That's a different conversation than I don't like him.
Yeah, that's super powerful for interviewers, right? Is you can be aware of who's coming in and how are you assessing. And I know, we train a lot, and so if you have people like recruiters or talent searchers, but then they're working with hiring managers who are completely different perspective of that experience. I think that's important for job seekers. How can they, if they can identify that they're one of these personality or interview styles, interview types, and they walk in, can they identify where the interviewer is coming from and how can they adapt to that, right? Maybe I'm a harmonizer and the person is clearly an examiner and they're just kind of clean cut. How do I mold those together?
So in my book, in every chapter, when I define each interview style, I do what I call strengths and overuse strengths, and also tips on how you come across and pre-interview mantras for you to relax a bit before the interview. I think it's less like we were saying before, that old interviewing advice is like, how do I memorize the perfect answers? It's less about adapting and mirroring their body language or doing what they do. And it's more about understanding where your baseline is and knowing where you can shift just enough, using your emotional intelligence and reading the room. I'm a charmer, for example. I want to get to know someone. I want someone to like me. And when I'm interviewing with an examiner, they're really tough. They're just going to go in. They don't really talk about personal stuff. They don't like stories. They just want to hear about business. I have to remember that I need to talk about how I'm qualified. I can't forget that aspect of the interview. If we zoomed out on an interview, it's two things. It's show that you're likable and a good culture fit, and show that you're technically qualified and capable. Charmers like to really think about like the personal component, and I feel like I can use the force of my personality and I'll just get them to like me, which often works, but then I forget to talk about how I'm qualified, and I forget to talk about the data and the metrics and the details. And so in zooming out, if I'm interviewing with an examiner, I would have to remind myself, okay, I need to stick to the facts more, and not tell as many stories. Connecting isn't as important to them as it is to me. I need to talk more about, that project that I worked on.
Yeah. And I think that was really neat when I got the report back after I took the assessment, and it gave you, these questions of if I'm asking a question of a challenger versus an examiner, here's a different way to be open to the answer of that question or engage in dialogue. And maybe you can expand on this, but I know a lot of companies, when you're interviewing, you might go through 4, 5, 6 interviews for the same position, but with different people. So you're yourself, but when you interview with HR, it might be different than the management, than the operations person, than whoever else. And so you're shifting your awareness, I guess, but not necessarily who you are.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other cool thing that I discovered in discovering interview styles is that we have a normal distribution of interview styles. So it's not like HR, they're always
Mm.
harmonizers. No, they can be examiners and challengers. And your hiring manager isn't necessarily just going to be an examiner. They could be charmers or harmonizers or challengers. And knowing that we all, no matter what our gender, our race, our age, the industry that we work in, the jobs that we have, that we can all be any of these interview styles. And the coolest thing I discovered of all of it is I really went into collecting research thinking that my style was going to be the best one. I'll be honest with
Right.
you. That
Of
was my
course.
hypothesis. I was like, I'm going to find one style, and of course it's going to be mine that like gets all the jobs. And it's the best thing that could have ever happened to me in my career. I was dead wrong. I collected all this research, and then I had all this data of our students who had gotten internships and job offers. And if that had been true, it would have been like all charmers would have been the ones getting job offers. And what I found, I had to look at the data like 7 times, was that there was an equal distribution of job offers, which means that we are all capable of nailing an interview. There isn't one interview style that's better than others. People often ask me, especially on social, which one's the best? Which one should I be? Again, back to that, just tell me the right answers, or, I'll just pretend to be a charmer if that's what's going to get me the job. And that's, I think, the hardest part of my job in giving tips and teaching people how to do this is I'm trying to rewrite this societal narrative that we have, that you need to pretend to be something that you're not, or, a big trigger for me is when someone hires me or asks me questions. They're like, okay, what's the right answer? Someone asks me, what's my weakness? What do I
Mhm.
tell them? I'm like, what? It's not the way it works.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's the part I want to explore a little bit. Before I go into that, because I know you've got a lot of great tips on how to be aware of those types of questions. And you've got some viral videos which are out there, which we were just talking about before the call. You've got probably well over 2 million people following you on all these accounts now, and I recommend people follow you for these short form videos of tidbits of information. But you talked about research, and it would be silly if we didn't highlight the fact that what we're talking about is evidence based, right? You had the opportunity to get this peer reviewed, and maybe for those that are interested in that concept, I think it's pretty cool and impressive to talk about where this came from and how it's been kind of scientifically validated.
Yeah, it was really important to me, right? I went to school for psychology, and I find a tremendous value in personality assessments. I don't know if you know, I'm sure some of your listeners know that Myers-Briggs, a globally popular
Right.
personality assessment, is actually junk science. There is no scientific rigor behind that assessment at all. So that was my intention, that it be a real thing, right? I didn't want it to be a horoscope.
Right.
So I hired the Assessment Standards Institute to take all of our data once we hit 2,000 respondents and check it all. A third party does it for you, and make sure that there isn't any bias in your data. And that was incredibly important to me. And it's probably the thing I'm most proud of, that and the fact that we donate our assessment. So we have a buy one, give one campaign. So for everyone that purchases a profile, we donate one to someone who was recently incarcerated with a get back to work program with a nonprofit here in Philadelphia. So those are two of the most proudest accomplishments, I think, in my career and my company.
Yeah, that's really incredible. Whether it's, um, somebody who needs it, like you're discussing, who hasn't had the opportunity for maybe mentorship, career advice, and experience in the field. And I know there's a lot of people that are just petrified of job interviews. They hate it. And people that have, I would love to have some of these resumes and go out and interview for a job, but they could have the credibility, but it's that interaction. They're petrified of. What do you think? I know there's a lot of this to go through, and I want to go through some of these big, most common questions or interactions people have. But what do you think is the cause of that biggest fear? And I know you went through some of that yourself. Of I don't want to be interviewed. I don't want to talk about myself.
Honestly, I've worked with over 10,000 clients at this point, and I think most of it is like a lot of things, it's the anticipation is worse than the actual event.
Yeah.
People equate sometimes job interviews with public speaking. It's not. It's generally an intimate conversation with you and one or two other people. Maybe you'll be in a panel interview, but still that's not public speaking, right? But that idea of you having to talk about yourself and your jobs and reasons for job moves and why you want what you want and what you're passionate about, if you don't talk a lot about yourself, or if you don't have a job where you do that, then it becomes, you're even more nervous and the anticipation is even more awful. And I think that's why a lot of people hire me to run through these interview questions with them to get the nerves out. And practicing really does make perfect when it comes to interviewing. I've never seen anyone get worse the more that they do it. So it
Right.
just sort of proves that it's more the anticipation around it. And of course, then there's this element of I need the job, I want to make more money. There are triggers of worthiness in job interviews, right?
Right.
And fear, and then there's this fear of authority, which happens quite frequently. So there's some other stuff, underneath that for other people, and there's lots of different little issues. But I think on the whole, it's sitting there in your truth, telling your story to a perfect stranger and having to remove this idea that they're going to approve of you or not and just be yourself. That's hard.
Yeah. Be vulnerable and open to rejection. That's not a safe space for a lot of most people. You mentioned as you go, you get better, right? But I think that requires feedback. And you and I were just talking before we started recording. Even you're doing a ton of videos, and when you do something that is going to social media, you're getting comments and likes within seconds, right? Feedback right away. How can interviewers or job seekers get feedback from an interview? Is that something that you could ever ask the interviewer, or how do you get that feedback other than just being self-aware?
It's a great question. If you're interviewing in the corporate world as a job seeker and you don't get the job, and you can send an email like, could I get any feedback? Here's the thing I tell people all the time. Number one, they're not going to tell you
Right.
because they're terrified of getting sued. I'm going to be
Right. Of
honest with
course.
you. And then if they do tell you, like, it's just going to be like, it's not going to be great feedback. They're not going to be totally honest with you. They can't because they're terrified of being sued. So I always say, if you really want feedback, or if you keep bombing your interviews, or you keep getting passed up and you're just not getting through to the next round, hire a career coach. I mean, we are trained to give you feedback, to run through some interview questions with you and tell you and pinpoint exactly what you're doing wrong. The hiring managers who are doing it, that's not their job.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. You ask the question and it's going to be a redacted response to protect the organization. And I know if I were to ask probably for feedback, I would argue in my head their feedback must be wrong. I did answer that question well, or I did, you're replaying a different in your head the way it went. But you mentioned career coach. What about resume writing, those types of things? Now we're dealing with a lot of kind of AI that's scanning these applications when they go in. So people aren't even getting to the interview, which is a whole nother topic. But Any suggestions on kind of professional resume writing, LinkedIn profiles, that type of thing?
Well, we've been having this issue with, these obstacles to get hired. Fill out this application in an applicant tracking system. These big
Yeah.
global companies use stuff like this. I could talk for hours about how biased and awful these systems are. They're terrible. If you don't have enough recruiters to look through resumes, you don't have enough recruiters to make sure that these aren't biased. It's a whole terrible problem. I write all about it in chapter 3 in my book. I'm very passionate about it, but we won't waste too much time talking about it. So that's really bad, right? Creating these obstacles in the way of hiring. And when it comes to AI, I mean, yeah, you could throw your resume in AI or get to, I've used AI. It's pretty bad. I mean, the stuff that it produces, like you're an interview, like I said before, is you telling your story. You could put into ChatGPT, what's the best answer to what's my weakness? But again, like you said, you'll just be reciting these answers. It's not you. And recruiters have a great bullshit detector. And
Yeah.
they're going to know pretty quickly if you're not really, giving them the straight answer. So it's easy. It's a little harder up front to get deep and think deeply about who you are and develop that self knowledge, like we're talking about. And then you almost ensure that you're going to find a job that's a good fit for you, rather than doing this like sort of just skimming the top and using AI. It doesn't work. These are
If
just
you,
shortcuts.
yeah, and if you keep saying this concept like self-aware, be yourself, be authentic, and I think it's really obvious, but we miss the point. Is sometimes people are in the job interview to get the offer, but not necessarily to get the job. You know what I mean? Like it's if I can pass this test and get accepted, I feel like I won the process, not realizing, well, now I got to work there, right? Who am I going to be when I show up to work in 2 weeks?
Well, it's like we said just a few minutes ago, it's hard to sit in an intimidating boardroom with an executive asking you difficult questions. It feels somewhat easier to cheat or have a script or pretend. It's hard to sit there and be vulnerable and let yourself be investigated in a
Yeah,
sense, right? But I really think that the harder way is often the best way, because
yeah,
that's the way you're going to figure out who you are in those moments without a script. Man, I've interviewed and mock interviewed lots of people, and when they have a script, I'm like, no, 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 we're not doing that. No,
yeah,
no, don't read something. I can tell you're reading something. It
right,
sounds so weird and so fake.
yeah,
Just speak from the heart, which is hard. We make it sound easy by just sitting here saying, be yourself, speak from the heart. That's actually the hardest thing. That's what I teach people how to do. How can you be authentic in these moments? And I've done it myself many times. I tell stories in my book. I open my book by telling a story of how I got into the University of Pennsylvania, by telling a very tough personal story. And I didn't do it because I was trying to pull on their heartstrings. I did it because like I had no other choice. I needed to explain my circumstances. And I think I stumbled on how to do this. And then I had a career in learning how to interview. And as I write this book and look back on it, I'm like, oh, I kind of was doing it right that, all along at the beginning, which is
yeah.
being yourself and being heart open and being authentic. And that's hard in a job interview.
Yeah, it's hard everywhere, right? And that's I think, when you read about the concept that you go through, I think about investigative interviews, networking, working in a team or a group, dating. It's all the same thing, right? You can go with this script and it's not going to work, but knowing who you are and bring that to the table is most important.
Oh, interviewing and dating are basically the same thing. I say it all the time in my videos.
Yeah, same red flags, same screening process. We just need better background checks in both.
Oh, yeah, totally. Putting yourself out there, and knowing yourself enough to know how to answer questions about yourself. I mean, I think a lot of problems in dating arise because the other person just didn't have enough self-awareness. And it's the same in interviewing, right? When you interview a candidate, you might think that you were duped or they lied to you. Maybe they're lying to themselves. Maybe they really thought that they were a perfectionist when they're really far from it. That is what really fascinates me about interviewing as hiring managers. And I've seen all sides of this over the last 12 years in consulting and teaching. I find it very interesting. Hiring managers have blind spots, job seekers have blind spots. And then when you match those two up, what happens? Same in
Right.
dating.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting. connection. I was having another conversation with another guest, and we were talking about the inability for people to even ask good questions, open-ended questions versus closed-ended questions, and know how to ask follow-up to keep a conversation going. Which brings me to a question for you about interviewers. I've seen a lot of organizations have scripts. We talked about scripts from the job seeker, but they might have interview packet A, packet B, packet C. Here's the questions we asked everybody. I know in your book, which makes sense, you talk about how this can mitigate bias because you have some structure. But is there obstacles to that, or things that interviewers can do to still be themselves while having to follow a organizational structure?
Yeah, well, the charmers and harmonizers are going to hate my answer, and the
Right.
challengers, but we want hiring managers to have scripts for a lot of reasons. It decreases and mitigates bias. It ensures that you're not saying anything inappropriate. Often, the most inappropriate questions come during the small talk portion before you open your interview
Mm.
prep kit, right? And I've seen it happen so many times where the hiring managers just, their heart's in the right place and they're just making chit chat. And then all of a sudden they've gotten seven questions answered that they should have never asked. Like, what does your husband do? Do you have kids? Like,
Right.
aw. We're 4 minutes in and we've already asked all of the inappropriate questions according to the EEOC.
Yeah. Yeah, but I've seen that, like what you said. I think it helps mitigate not only bias, but then comparing candidate to candidate, because you're at least asking similar questions of everybody, um, versus one person got asked more extensively about their background than another, and now what is the perception of why you did that? I think can be a problem.
For sure. I mean, everything needs to be more scientific in the corporate interviewing process. So, I have seen some hiring managers take one candidate to breakfast and then the other, they
Mm.
have a Zoom interview and then someone else they have come in for the interview. I mean, how do you
Right.
compare those three candidates? They have totally different experiences. So, creating an interview team, asking everyone the same questions, having the same people present, doing it really in the same afternoon if you can, and have everyone debrief when it's all fresh. You have someone taking notes, someone, making sure that these questions are derived from the job description. And all of that is going to help you make much better hiring decisions. If that's the only thing that you do in your process, that and not talk so much as a hiring manager, you're going to do much better.
Yeah, that's good feedback. I think the last kind of section I wanted to cover is, job seekers are always wondering how to handle some of these. Just they may feel like curveballs, but I feel like it's the same questions they get asked all the dang time, just trying to figure out what's the appropriate response. And so I wanted to go through some of these, and I've learned a lot of your responses from some of your social media posts. So again, I recommend people follow you because there's a lot of great advice on there. But the first one, which is almost always the first question, is this "Tell me about yourself" question, and which I feel like is a dangerous avenue to go down, right? Because you're not sure, do I talk about my personal life? Do I talk about work? What is important to them? What's important to me? But I know you can't give a script for everyone, but how do I receive that question as a job seeker?
Yeah, don't get personal. Number one, this is not a date, this is a job interview. And it's very important that you talk about. I always give a formula or a framework rather. So instead of, telling someone a script, I say focus this way. Tell them a little bit about your past. What are you doing presently that would qualify you for the position? And what do you want in the future? And the future, spoiler alert, is why you want to work at this company. So past, present, future can give you your story some framework, a guide, right? If you're not a good storyteller, remember a beginning, a middle, and an end. All of your answers need to have a bit of that framework, and then you can practice using that. I like starting with, why did you go to college? Did you major in this? What are you passionate about? Why do you love this so much? You can highlight a little bit of if you had some impressive internships or some interesting jobs that you had. Then you get into presently, what am I currently doing that would qualify me? And then future, where do you see yourself? But you would never ever answer, and I should put this on my tombstone when I die. Never ever answer this question by saying, "Well, I'm married and I have 4 kids." Like,
Right.
no, that's not
Well,
the answer in a job interview.
no. And I would think as a hiring manager, I'm kind of petrified to get that response now too, because now I'm thinking, if now we go down that route, is that the reason I did or did not hire somebody, which is not what I was asking for in the first place.
Right. You can't control what people tell you.
Right. The other questions obviously that come up all the time are the behavioral based type questions. Tell me about a time, insert whatever. And so, a lot of what we hear about is tell me about a time you had a conflict with a coworker and how you handled it, or a conflict at work and how you handled it. What are job seekers supposed to do that, right? You want to be genuine and sincere and truthful, but are there some key points that hiring managers are looking for in that question?
Yeah, we're not looking, here's the thing, we're not looking for perfection. We're not looking for someone to be, have never failed or never had an issue or always, arrives at the perfect solution. We're humans. No, what we want to hear is, what did you learn from your failure? We want to hear, how did you handle it? What's your philosophy? How do you deal with this? We want to see your attitude. We want to hear you wrestle with something so we can understand how you would work through a problem. When they ask you a tough question in an interview, it's not so much gotcha journalism. It's more like, I want to see if you can do this. If you can tell us how you're going to think through your problem or this issue, then we'll have a good understanding of who you are and how you're qualified and capable. It's less, projecting perfectionism, and it's more about, this is my thought process. This is how I would handle it. I believe it's really important to listen to people, build relationships, and I think you do that through trust. And this is what I would do, X, Y, and Z, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that's really good, and it kind of translates probably to this other question that can be uncomfortable for people who have ever been fired from a job, have a gap in employment, maybe they left school early before being able to graduate, maybe they got laid off, or whatever the case may be. But answering those questions where there's clearly maybe a failure or a miss on the candidate's point of view, what's the best way, I guess, if there is one, to discuss something, a blemish on your career record?
Own it, take responsibility, and talk about what you learned. That
Yeah.
if you've been fired, and I've heard many people go through these, different machinations, I don't care. At the end of the day in the interview, what we want to hear is, what did you learn from it? Being fired or having laid off or made a big mistake isn't the deal breaker. It's not understanding, what did you gain from it. Again, it's back to self-awareness. We all fail. We have all been in tough situations. It's, how do you come out on top? How are you braver, wiser, stronger? How can you explain, how did this help you grow? And if you're resistant, negative, pessimistic, they're going to see you as a negative to the organization. You might be a cancer in the organization. They're not going to hire. I've interviewed lots of people who had horrific answers to these questions. And you're like, okay, we don't need that here. We don't want that here. And so there are, of course, like all interview answers, there could be really bad ones, of course,
Yeah.
right? So, yeah.
I think that's on point because if somebody says, well, I got fired, but my boss was a real jackass, or I got fired because the company had unrealistic metrics. Maybe that's true and that's how they felt, but then you feel like, is that a predictor of future behavior here of what we're going to hear? There's no accountability.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's what hiring managers are always thinking. Is that how they're
Yeah.
going to talk about me in the future?
Right. Well, and there's another question that you created that you discussed in one of your videos. It's kind of similar where you asked a candidate, maybe tell me about what you love or you don't like about your current job. And that can be one that I might freak out a little bit about, well, I got to tell them something I don't like about my current job, but I don't want to come across negative.
Yeah, we're two adults here that we might possibly work together, and I might be your boss. And if we can't have an open and direct conversation about real stuff, that could potentially be a red flag.
Yeah.
I want to know, what are the things you love and hate? What are your strengths and weaknesses? What are you working on? And when I post videos about what are your strengths and weaknesses online, people just come for me in the comments. This is such a stupid question. I'm like, actually, this is the best. I think this is the best interview question there is, right? I want to know, what's your weakness. If you can't tell me what your weakness is in an interview, it's self-awareness. That's what I always say.
Are we over this concept of my biggest weakness is somehow a strength. One of these
No,
flippers.
not totally. I
Okay.
mean, I always say it has to be true. Your weakness has to be real, right? Don't tell me you're a perfectionist. Do you know how many perfectionists I've
Right.
interviewed?
Right.
They're not all perfectionists. But it does have to have an element of like, how can I construe this as a strength? Like,
Sure.
there are some weaknesses you should never use in an interview, like I'm a procrastinator or I
Right.
can't get anywhere on time. Like
Right.
that, you, why?
Like I struggle delegating,
That's
but
a good one.
having a positive spin to it. I know that's always one that personally has been a struggle. Is how do I talk about a weakness without giving you all the reasons not to hire me at the same time?
Personally, I get pretty vulnerable and real. If someone were to ask me, I would say, listen, I'm type A. It's probably one of
Mm,
my best characteristics, especially as an employee, but it's probably one of my worst characteristics as someone that you would have to work with and live with. I want what I want when I want it. I have no patience, which makes me incredibly goal oriented, and I get everything done. And I hold myself to incredibly high expectations. But at the same time, it's really difficult for me to be patient, to allow things to happen when they're supposed to. I have to rely on other people. And I really admire type B folks who can be slightly more relaxed because I am not. And that is the biggest negative of my personality. I will be open about it and I am honest. Like, it's hard. I am hard charging. I have expectations up to here. But a hiring manager hears that and they're like, awesome,
you're
great.
hired. Gotcha. Yeah,
Exactly.
that's
But there's a
perfect.
truth to it. I'm going to give
Right.
myself a heart attack.
Right. Well, I was going to say it's a great answer, and people listening are probably taking down notes, but don't use that if that's not you. We said that the last 35 minutes of the conversation.
Yeah,
Be
yeah,
yourself.
exactly. I say it all the time. People will be like, oh, that's such a great answer. I'm like, it's my answer. And
Right.
it's a good answer because I know myself and it's true. And it sounds so good because it's real. And then my job is I work with clients to help them fuss around with this. Like they'll be like, I don't know what it is. And we'll spend 10 or 15 minutes on a call and we'll work it out. And then we'll stumble upon to the thing. I'm like, tell me what it really is. And then I'll help you craft the answer. And we get there. And that's how you come up with great interview answers. It's not reading something online or listening to someone say their answer. It's digging deep for yourself and what has your husband told you? What has your ex-boss told you? What has your college professor told you? What your mom told you? There's always grains of truth in there,
Yeah.
Someone's going to tell you what your weakness is, and then you can expand on that and then talk about it in a professional context.
Well, I like this. You kind of mentioned this there is practice, right? It's okay to call a friend who maybe is a hiring manager for somebody else, or they're just a friend and they'll be transparent with you, but have them ask you some of these questions and go through it, I think could be
Mhm.
helpful.
I make TikToks all the time. I tell people all you have to do, you don't have to buy my book, you don't have to get my profile. All you have to do is open the camera on your phone and record yourself answering these 5 questions. Tell me about yourself. Why should I hire you? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? What are your strengths and weaknesses? And you just practice those answers and you practice them. Record yourself and watch it back and you're going to hate it. And it's so cringe and it's terrible. And then you do it again and you're like, you know what? I actually really liked my answer there, or I forgot this part of it. Let me try it again. And you do that a couple more times. You don't even need someone to help you. I mean, that's wonderful if you have a coach or a friend or a mentor, but if you don't, that is just as effective.
It's great. Simple advice, cheap advice to fix.
Mhm.
Last question I had for you, and then we'll wrap up. At the end of an interview, is this opportunity for job seekers to turn the interview around a little bit and ask questions of the hiring manager. I always get frustrated when they don't ask any questions because I'm kind of excited. Okay, it's my turn to answer something, but and then educate about the company or the brand. Any suggestions on maybe the top questions or types of questions to come prepared with?
Do your research. Think deeply about why you want this job. Ask them questions about the job description. If it's the hiring, my big piece of advice is if it's an HR person, ask them questions that they can answer, like company culture and this interview process and questions that they can answer. If it's a hiring manager, ask them questions about the day-to-day responsibilities of the position. What are projects you're currently working on that I could help you with? I have lots of these videos pinned to my pages on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook, specifically about great, impressive questions to ask in an interview. but truly they come out of your own research and like, what do you want to know? And then look through some of my videos or look through some of these articles and see how you craft that into be a professional sounding question if you need help with that. But I think the best questions come from your curiosity. Like, where do you see this job leading for a top performer? You know, where did the incumbent move on to? You know, did they get promoted? And if so, what did they do to get that promotion? I mean, those are all great questions to ask in an interview beyond like, I read your website and I really like your mission and values. Can you tell me more about your company? Like,
Right.
no, don't do
Right.
that.
That's not a memorable question either. If the hiring manager's got 15 people they're talking to that day,
Yeah.
you just got absorbed into the abyss. Yeah.
Well, it just feels like you're just like checking a box and you're
Right.
just like, you felt like you had to ask a question rather than just like ask me a real question. So at the end of the day, we're just having a conversation. I want to see if you will be a good fit here. You want to see if this job will be, you know, not just pay you well, but like give you interesting work. So ask questions about that.
Well, before we wrap up, I know we've mentioned your social media profiles a million times, but it hasn't been giving people the actual handle. So what's the best way social media wise to find you?
Yeah, you can just look for my name, Anna Papalia. That's my handle everywhere. I post the same video on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. So you can follow me wherever you get your social media content. I'm there.
Yeah, I recommend it. It's great content. You make it fun too. I mean, these aren't these drawn out, boring videos. They're fun, they're quick, and they're really educational and can help you as a hiring manager, as a job seeker, which is great. So thank you for doing that for the industry. Thanks for your time today. I've got Anna's book here, Interviewology. So I definitely recommend this. I went through the profile assessment a few years ago, and as I mentioned earlier, found out I was a harmonizer, and I've just learned so much. It made sense, kind of like you mentioned the horoscope correlation earlier. Like it made sense when I was reading it, but when I actually start to apply some of the concepts, there's maybe a better communicator and a better interviewer. So I recommend people to do that. And I'll check out your website at theinterviewology.com. But before we wrap up, give you an opportunity of any one last truth, one last takeaway for people that are listening, whether job seekers or hiring managers, to walk away with.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you for that. And thank you for getting my book. I really appreciate it. A truth for me in collecting all this research and doing all of this and sort of coming full circle with all of this for me was my original hypothesis was I thought that, you know, I was going to discover one best interview style and that mine was going to be the best interview style. Well, there was a grain of truth to that. And that I discovered that we all think that. That is the truth about interviewing. We all think that the way that we do it is the best. We all think that the way that we do it is going to be the way everyone should do it. And that was a universal truth that I uncovered in this process and realized that we all can benefit from being more open-minded. And that's what this research and writing this book has taught me. I wrote this book as I had my children, and having children in the same way they open you up and you love things, you know, that are outside of you, and teaching so many college students taught me we don't all do this the same way. And we need each other. We need the differences in the interview process. I can't be the only one there. I need an examiner and a harmonizer and a challenger to balance me out. And that, I think, has been the most interesting thing and totally unexpected blessing that happened from collecting this research. And the truth that I stumbled on is that there is different ways to do this, but we all think we're doing it the right way. But the counterintuitive thing is we need each other to do it.
Yeah, I think that's a great ending, right? You talked a lot today about being self-aware, but it's also being aware of all the other perspectives and how to balance within. So that's great. Well, I appreciate your passion because it's generated a whole bunch of great content and support for people in the field. So thanks for that. Thanks for your time today. And thank you all for joining us on this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And to keep this conversation going, follow the Truth Be Told podcast on LinkedIn and Truth Be Told CFI on Twitter. On behalf of the International Association of Interviewers, Rick Lander-Zalowski, and our valued sponsors, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast.